So thank you very much to Andrew and also to Marine Money for the invitation. I'm sorry we're doing it virtually too. It would be great to see everybody. I'm Steve Saxon, partner with McKinsey, and I'm based in Shanghai. I'm going to talk about decarbonizing shipping. I'm going to talk about the challenge. I'm going to talk about the future pathways, in particular around fuels towards decarbonization. And then finally, I'm going to suggest some ideas around the way forward for the industry and the different players in the industry. I'll talk for 20 minutes or so, and I very much welcome Q&A to come in as well, and we should get time to do some of that before the hour. Let's put this in context. Transport is around 24% of global emissions. Shipping is around 3% of global emissions. Global greenhouse gas emissions. However, the reason that there's a real focus on decarbonizing transport is because, frankly, transportation is not doing a terribly good job. If you look at the trend in terms of how greenhouse gas emissions have been developing in different sectors since 1990, you'll see that most sectors are actually trended downwards. Okay, they're not quite yet to the levels of the 95% reduction target, which is the red line here, but at least they're headed in the right direction, which is down. Transportation, and within that shipping, unfortunately, has been headed up. There's some recent declines, but look, it's clearly a sector which has not been successful in decarbonizing thus far. And hence, there's a lot of public scrutiny and regulator scrutiny on transport. However, shipping is a hard sector to decarbonize. This chart shows an abatement curve for different types of usage and different greenhouse gas emissions. The way to read this, the left-hand side tells you the cost of abating a equivalent ton of carbon dioxide. And so things below the line, actually, there is an economic benefit as well as a environmental benefit. The things above the line means there's an actual cost, an economic cost to decarbonizing. And you'll notice that getting shipping to zero carbon is actually towards the right-hand side. So there could be an argument which says, look, actually, there's a lot of work to do elsewhere. And if you were really trying to do the economically optimal thing for the world, you would let shipping continue to use carbon-heavy fuels for a while, and you'd focus on these other sectors first. However, that's not acceptable. There's a clear pressure, and the pressure is coming from a variety of directions where shipping must decarbonize as well. This pressure is coming from regulators such as the IMO. It's coming from the capital markets, including many of the people on this call, I would think, who've signed up to the Poseidon Principles. It's coming from customers, in particular the container lines. Many of the leading shippers have supply chain carbon reduction initiatives. The shippers are putting pressure on their shipping lines and saying, look, you need to be reducing the carbon footprint. We want to be able to achieve a carbon neutral supply chain. And it's coming from competitive pressures as well. We're seeing some shipping companies moving ahead of others here, and that's putting pressure on others within the industry. Let's have a look at what is the challenge. This chart looks at the regulatory announcements and targets versus a 2008 baseline. And the IMO, at least in the current version of the plans, is aiming for a 40% intensity reduction by 2030 compared to 2008. And by 2050, a 50% absolute greenhouse gas reduction versus 2008 as a baseline. And of course, because shipping is growing over that period, that implies somewhere between 70 and 85% intensity reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from shipping, depending on what you believe in terms of growth. Now, there's been some recent news from the IMO that maybe these timelines aren't going to stick as shown here. However, others, in particular the EU, has been very clear that if global regulation is delayed, it will step in. And so I think there's an increasing risk that we actually end up with a patchwork. We end up with a series of fragmented different regulatory frameworks moving at different speeds. Some are moving even faster. The Norwegians, for example, are requiring zero emissions in the heritage fjords even earlier. How do we get there? Well, part of the answer is going to be through ship efficiency. So we can look at what is the total emissions today, how much do we see growing through demand, assuming that we just continue with today's technologies, and then how do we build down in terms of hitting the target? And we do see operational efficiency practices able to reduce by up to 28%. And maybe in an extreme case, if we were to say, okay, let's do super slow steaming of all types of shipping, maybe that could get us up to 55% reduction. But still, it's not enough. So it's not going to come only through efficiency. We're therefore going to need to decarbonize the fuels burnt as well. And that's going to be the additional 40 to 60% to bring us down to the 2050 target. Let's have a look at the sorts of initiatives we're talking about. On operational efficiency, there's things which are just good ideas, like better communication between ports and the ships, better communication between headquarters and the vessels can reduce waiting time and reduce idling time. There's a real economic decision in the supply chains around speed reduction, which is unlikely to be enforced, but can probably be encouraged through economics. The imposition of a carbon tax, for example, would encourage vessels to move slower. There's a series of things which can be done around optimizing voyages, improving weather prediction tools, ensuring consistent power usage of the engines. And there's something around capacity as well, making sure that when a ship sails, that it does sail full. There's a series of things which kind of, as the price of shipping through the pressure on decarbonization increases, become a good idea. There's then things within the ship, installing waste heat recovery systems, auxiliary system efficiency, better hull designs, improved coatings for the hulls, lightweight materials, and scale. Like, I know we've all been looking at how ships have been increasing, especially container ships have been increasing over the last 15 years. Increased size does help reduce carbon emissions per unit. So this will ensure that there's continued pressure for larger ships. However, we're going to need to move into the alternative fuels area, and I'll spend more time talking about this in a moment. But there's a variety of things on the table, from biofuels, synthetic fuels, hydrogen-based fuels, and also electric in the form of shore power and batteries. Carbon offsets are possible. Now, under the Paris agreements, they're not an acceptable way for a company to be reducing its emissions. However, the development of carbon credits and the carbon markets, I think, will be an important part of shipping. In particular, as some companies start to lead and go and move further than others in the industry, they need a way of being rewarded for that. And carbon markets are a good way of encouraging innovation. So in summary, through this first section, what's the challenge? So we need to make sure there's a level playing field. We want to make sure that early adopters are rewarded for their investments, and to prevent shipping companies being able to say, okay, I'm going to lag behind, I'm going to see what everyone else is doing, and receiving an economic surplus for doing that. So we need to find a way to reward early adopters and innovators. We need to make the economics of these future fuels work. And at the moment, there is not a clear leader in terms of the fuel of the future. So making that decision now is actually very hard. And part of that is because of the technical viability. There are lots of pilots underway of fuel cells, of methanol, and so on, but there's no one solution which is truly technically ready and deployable at scale, which meets the emissions targets. Shipping requires more than just the ships to change. Like, in particular, bunkering and the supply chain needs to shift as well. And therefore, we are likely to see one or maybe maximum two dominant fuels emerge for the future. And so there's sort of a winner-takes-all choice in terms of the technologies. That means, given the long lifetime of the assets, like we're making decisions on new ships for 25 years or more, that actually there's a real incentive to kind of delay. Let's see what technology is going to emerge, what becomes viable, and there's a winner-takes-all scenario around that future technology. And that's the real change which we need to try and break. Otherwise, the whole industry is going to hold back. So moving on, let's look forward at potential solutions. I'm going to talk in particular about those future fuel pathways which are possible. What's happening today? First of all, what's actually deployed out there? There are 385 ships running on LNG, 375 running on batteries, 15 methanol, 2 hydrogen, and 1 ammonia pilot. All great, but dwarfed in comparison to the 65,000 ships in the global fleet. So there are pilots underway, but they are small scale at the moment. And there's not a lot of cohesion in terms of the views about the fuels of the future. This chart, which pulls together 5 different projections from different research bodies who've looked at this, come to quite different conclusions. How much is battery going to play a role? What's going to be the role of LNG? You see the biofuel purple is different on each of these charts. And so there is not a clear view yet out there. The jury's still out there on what the fuel of the future is going to be. Let's have a look into some of the options around the fuels of the future and what are the different pros and cons of them. The ships of today are mostly powered by the first 2, the HFO and the marine gas oil of the top 2. They have the highest greenhouse gas emissions, and they also score poorly on the particulate matter emissions. However, the cost of ownership, as we know, is good and is competitive. LNG still has high greenhouse gas emissions, unfortunately. So I know that some companies have adopted it because it does lead to a reduction in immediate carbon dioxide, 20 to 30% lower on CO2 emissions. However, as we saw the targets earlier, we need larger emissions than this. So LNG coming from fossil fuel sources is not going to be the solution of the fuels of the future. In addition, unfortunately, LNG is methane gas, and there is methane slip in the current engines. And while the CO2 emissions might be 20 to 30% lower, much of that is made up for by the more potent methane slipping back into the environment. So fossil fuel-based solutions are not going to get us to the target. We're therefore looking at the bottom half of this chart for what's going to be the fuel of the future. First one is there could be bio sources. It does reduce the carbon intensity. However, there's still greenhouse gas emissions through the production of biofuels, even if we're using secondary sources of fuels. The good news about it is that biodiesel can be dropped into existing engines relatively easily. And biogas could be used as a future pathway for ships which are choosing an LNG path in the near term. We need to be careful that it doesn't push out other sources, however. The last thing we want is that crops start getting grown on which could be used for producing food just to power ships. And there's questions around how to monitor the sustainability of the supply chain as well. Methanol could be produced through green hydrogen sources, and there are some pilots out there as well. Methanol can only be net zero if it's produced from a green source of hydrogen. However, it could be a sustainable fuel which works with relatively limited modifications in some of today's engines. Ammonia is very promising. Ammonia is a form of, and here we talk about green ammonia or potentially blue ammonia. So where either the ammonia itself is produced from renewable energy sources, or it's produced from fossil fuel sources, but with carbon capture and sequestration. Ammonia is attractive in that it eliminates the greenhouse gas emissions and the SOx emissions and the particulate matter, and scores reasonable on the NOx as well. It can be burnt in conventional engines, or it can be used in fuel cells as well for a new generation of fuel. However, the technology readiness score here is currently only at a 5. It's not yet ready for large-scale deployment. And ammonia is toxic as well. So that we will need new ways of handling the fuels in order before it becomes comfortable that ammonia can be used as a widespread source for shipping. And lastly is hydrogen itself. Again, needs to be produced from green or blue sources. However, there's lots of work underway to create hydrogen through electrolyzers from renewable fuels from solar power and wind power, for example. The most likely technology here is going to be using fuel cells to generate electricity and then using that to power the ships. Scores really well across all of the life cycle emissions. However, economically today, producing hydrogen at that scale does not work. In addition, the storage requirements for hydrogen actually make it quite challenging for some long-haul ocean-going vessels. And to just get into a little bit about the physics here in terms of the what we're looking for ideally in a fuel. We'd love something which has a high volumetric energy density, which means kind of it's got a lot of energy in a small space, which is high on the vertical axis. We also want it high on the horizontal axis as well. We want it to have a high energy density in terms of weight as well. There is nothing, unfortunately, in the top right-hand side of this chart, apart from nuclear, which is only going to be adopted very selectively in shipping. The challenge with hydrogen is, although it scores well in terms of the energy density per liter, the energy density per kilogram, it scores less well on the energy density per liter, meaning that you need large fuel tanks to carry either compressed hydrogen or liquefied hydrogen. Ammonia is okay, but look, it's still going to need larger tanks than we would have today for the heavy fuel oils or some of the synthetic fuels which could be used. And you'll notice batteries on here. Batteries is right at the bottom left-hand corner. Even with very significant development of battery technology, it's never going to be applicable for long voyage shipping. However, batteries absolutely have their place. They have their place on short sea shipping. They have their place on ferries, and they'll have their place as a supplementary system as well to act as energy storage alongside one of the other solutions. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a large number of pilots out there at the moment. Batteries go in ro-ro ships and ferries and cruise ships and tugs. Hydrogen fuel cells across the board, especially in the more shorter sea shipping. There's some ammonia-based pilots out there. Some are trying methanol, and synthetic fuel is relatively easy because it can be dropped into existing engines and existing fuel systems. The decision, it will be highly based on economics, but it goes beyond economics as well. And the answers will be different for different types of shipping, therefore, depending on what's the trip range. Do you know you're always going to return to a particular port, like a ferry, or is it going to be globally deployed? How frequently is it calling at ports, and how frequently you're therefore willing to bunker? What about the safety? In particular, passenger ships. Ammonia is unlikely to take to be used in cruise ships, for example. For some types of shipping, you can burn the cargo as a fuel. LNG and LPG tankers, and even potentially hydrogen tankers in the future, might be able to use the cargo as a fuel. And then different types of ships are more compatible to having larger fuel tanks versus others. And so the solution might be different in different sectors, depending on each of these different priorities. We see ammonia as a clear leader, especially for the longer haul shipping technologies. And this assumes that we can develop the engines and develop the fuel cells to make this a real viable solution at scale. We see batteries and hydrogen fuel cells working more on the shorter sea applications. So finally, in terms of a way forward, what's it going to take to get there? First of all, we need the customers to continue to demand this. And I think we see that happening. The ultimate customer plus the retailers in the supply chain are all demanding lower carbon and putting pressure on their supply chain. And we're going to need some protocols and standards as well to be able to monitor the emissions, to be able to prove to the ultimate customer that, look, we are on a path to decarbonization. We're going to need support from investors, and that includes the ship leasing companies, to prioritize the financing of green assets. We're going to need some policies and regulations, because the economics alone are not going to push shipping down decarbonization. We're going to need either binding targets in terms of emissions, or we're going to need carbon taxes and carbon surcharges to make the higher emitting fuels uneconomic. The IMO has made good progress on that. However, there's been some recent setbacks to the timelines. It's clear that other regulators will pick up that mantle, potentially with even stronger and quicker ambitions than the IMO. The industry itself needs to lead, and we see a lot of potential here for consortiums to develop the technologies and to test the technologies. It doesn't just need shipping companies, it needs the fuel creators, it needs the bunkering companies, it needs the energy companies all working together across the supply chain to create these new solutions. And it's going to be a winner takes all or maximum two technologies is of the future. And so it does require industry working together to get there. And lastly, we're going to need some technological enhancements. Like we do still need more R&D on hydrogen electrolyzers, on fuel cells, and on the safety of deploying these at scale at sea. We've been working with many shipping companies to determine and help them on their future path and help through the shipping choice. And we've got a series of models which we'd be happy to take anyone through if interested. Thank you very much. Welcome. Any questions? I think we have 5 minutes or so left at the end. Would welcome the opportunity to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve, for that insightful and interesting presentation. We do have a few questions that have come in, so I'm gonna take this opportunity to ask you a few of those. You know, you mentioned different fuel sources and different paths to decarbonization. You haven't mentioned wind, and a person from the audience is asking, how about wind power?
Actually, very exciting. It's not going to be the only propulsion solution, but installing wind in addition to some of these other technologies is looking very promising. There's some of the kite-based solutions, there's sort of rotor-based solutions, there's sail-based solutions all being piloted, but they're showing the ability to handle 20 to 30% of the power of the large ocean-going ships. 20 to 30% reduction is a big chunk in terms of trying to help get towards those ultimate goals. So I think we do see wind as being very promising as a supplementary source towards the ambitions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Another question that came in is, in other shipping discussions, there seemed consensus that the winner-takes-all solution for a new fuel is still about 5 years away. How does that affect shipping decisions over the next 5 years, and especially with regards to new buildings? Yeah,
excellent question, and one which many clients are asking us at the moment. Look, what do I do today? Look, the short answer is that it is unclear, and that's actually leading a lot of people to delay investments in new ships. That might be good more broadly for shipping markets. Many markets remain oversupplied, and so actually if there was a holding back of new ordering for the next 4 or 5 years, that might actually help the markets as well. So some people are just choosing, look, I need to wait it out. Others are choosing to install more flexible technologies. So one client we were working with is making the ship as hydrogen ready as they can, like predicting that, yes, there will be some form of hydrogen coming in the future. We don't know exactly, but let's leave sufficient space and flexibility in the design of the vessel that we can install. We have an idea how we'd install liquefied hydrogen tanks and fuel cells within that ship in the future. And of course, that's going to increase costs, but it can make sense now to hedge your bets by saying, look, we're going to build in optionality into the new builds we're creating. The final option, and this is for those with large fleets, the final option is to kind of do a little bit of everything. And we're seeing some shipping lines saying, okay, we're building some which are still HFO powered and maybe could have a biofuel future. We're doing some which are LNG powered and maybe could take a biogas future. We're going to do some which are methanol and ready. And then lastly, I'd encourage everyone to be looking at, okay, well, how can I get involved in some of the pilots here? What would it take to create the first ammonia powered vessel in my particular sector?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question, who or what will be first mover? Will it be a country? Will it be a global institution or a huge shipping company? And what are the dangers of being the first mover within shipping?
Yeah, so we've already seen some first movers. There are particular countries with decarbonization much higher up the agenda and are pushing their shipping companies ahead of others. Norway stands out as an example. Even the broader EU is likely to regulate ahead of much of the rest of the world. It's being driven by local pressures and local priorities. And therefore, the first applications we're seeing are in these places, and they're going to be short sea shipping within Europe. I think will be one of the first areas to explore decarbonization solutions. That's why lots of these pilots, whether it's the battery-powered tugs or the methanol-powered ferries, we're seeing those applications are increasingly in Europe. However, look, China has just announced some very aggressive ambitions as well to decarbonize the economy by 2060. As Lan said, that's part of the plan for the 14, that's part one of the announcements alongside the 14th five-year plan. And so we could well see some domestic pilots in China of decarbonized ships and decarbonized fuels as well. What are the risks?
Thanks.
Look, the risk of moving first is that you're choosing a more expensive technology, and therefore you've made it uneconomic versus others who are getting a free ride by continuing to use today's technologies. And that, as I mentioned, that's where regulation is clearly going to need to play a role, but also carbon markets here as well. You could imagine setting a price for carbon, and those who are further ahead on decarbonizing shipping can therefore are generating excess credits. Those credits could therefore be sold to other people in the shipping community who have maybe had a more wait and see view in terms of when they'll adopt new fuels.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, we've read recently about a few companies adopting that approach. As you were giving your answer there, we got another question that fits in nicely. It's how do you see the reaction of the Chinese shipping community to the decarbonization target? So looking at China more specifically, what do you see happening there?
I actually think it's very exciting because it gives them some direction. Like most of the discussions I've had in decarbonization have been globally, and yes, there's always been some interest in China, but kind of there's never been a really clear signal that okay, what path is China going to be on? The recent government announcements makes it clear that look, China is going to decarbonize as well on an aggressive time frame. I think that is the clarity which the entire Chinese industry needed, that, okay, we need to now be finding solutions. And so I expect we're going to see over the next year some big announcements from the shipbuilders in China through to the energy providers in China, through to China's domestic shipping companies around, okay, here's the pilots we're going to do, here's the pathways we're going to explore for decarbonizing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll be looking out for those announcements. On the financing side, are there any financing schemes available at the moment, or do you foresee financing schemes being available for kind of startup green ship owners, or for ship owners who are looking to transition to a more environmental way of running their business?
So in terms of the research, there's a number of companies in the shipping community have set up grants, have set up research centers to explore these new technologies. And we've helped several of our clients do that. And clearly, given where the technology readiness is at the moment, we need more research. And so kind of it is incumbent on the shipping community to be funding that research. And so that's the first priority which we're seeing happening. Is there help and support for that? Yes. In most cases, that's coming directly from governments in the form of grants to help explore decarbonizing shipping. Over the longer term, we are seeing lessors and ship financing companies increasingly looking at what is the greenhouse gas performance of the ship as part of determining the financing. I think the Poseidon principles, which have been talked about at Marine Money, is a great example of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that takes us to the end of session 1 of today's Marine Money China 2020 conference. Thank you, Mrs. Lan and Steve, for your insights and for opening the conference this morning. For those of you listening in, this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on our website later today or tomorrow. We will also send a follow-up email tomorrow with some contact details. So if your question wasn't answered today, you can follow up with our speakers from tomorrow. Please note that the second session of today's conference is at 2 p.m. Shanghai time. So please be sure to register and join us for that. More information for registering for the conference can be found on our website at www.marinemoney.com. Thank you again for tuning in. This is your host, Andrew Oates from Marine Money, signing out.